Hello and welcome to the 26th installment of Aaron Walker Art Talk. I'm Aaron Walker and I'm again joined by Rebecca Zeines. Rebecca, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Awesome. So today you have chosen Bluebeard, my painting. Why don't you go ahead and explain why you chose that?
So the first thing that I thought of was the title, and it reminded me of Blackbeard. And the whole story behind that. And then the piece itself made me think of a recent conversation that I've had during a book club at FEE around JBP and toxic masculinity, JBP being the short for Jordan B. Peterson. And so that this painting reminded me a lot of the male stereotypes that we were describing often in relation to toxic masculinity, or as like the physical ideal of masculine perfection, especially with the hipster movement with beards and stuff nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm interested to know how your understanding of toxic masculinity, especially say in that context, relates to the painting itself, let's say.
This painting is the physical representation of what a lot of people think is the physical ideal of a man. And I will be honest and say that I have met many men in my life who look somewhat along the lines of Bluebeard and who were attractive to me because of that. And so having a painting depicting that with the Bluebeard and just it immediately reminded me of reading about just what is masculinity, what is good versus toxic masculinity. And so just my thoughts went on a big tangent.
Well, very cool. The actual subject for this, so this one came from a reference picture, but it is some guy on Tumblr who's a fashion blogger. He's a gay fashion blogger. And I just thought it was beautiful. The aesthetics were really nice. This is a common trend with a lot of these pictures is that I just think that someone has wonderful aesthetic sensibilities. So I want to recreate them on canvas.
And that's good enough. That's good enough of a reason to want to do that.
Mm-hmm. And this one, from a technical side, I was playing with looseness, especially with the strokes. So you can see around the border, there's a certain effect, which you brought up in the previous episode, of going beyond the border, right, to create the 3D effect. But in this one, the border is has all these very loose red dots and then red lines, and sort of the impressionistic way, right? So impressionistic, very loose strokes and pasto strokes. And so, yeah, that was mostly what I was playing with and considering going into it. Oh,
I find it very ironic that you just mentioned that it was a gay fashion blogger, and I'm talking about toxic masculinity. I see a certain amount of irony in that.
Right. I mean, well, it just goes, I don't know. I mean, there are leftist critiques of gay culture and how it's still holding on to masculine ideals. There's a guy named Jack Donovan who wrote a book called Androphilia. So Jack Donovan is a homosexual man, and he writes about being in the gay community and how he feels that it's increasingly moving towards basically the idealization of feminine traits and feminine culture, and saying, hey girl, aren't we so sassy? He's well, no, I'm gay because I love men and I love masculinity. So I mean, there's certainly different perspectives. And so your original impetus, I don't think, is your original impression of oh, this reminded me of masculine stereotypes. I don't think that it's improper just because it's a gay guy.
No, it's not necessarily about propriety. It's interesting. I found it just ironic that I would make a joke about, when we talk about toxic masculinity, we tend to talk about it in the context of heterosexual relationships, as well as parental rapport of what does the father figure look like in a relationship. And that's something that anyone from whether straight, gay, or LGBTQ plus can relate to at least some way or somehow, whether it's an absent father or a bad one, or even a present one. But it's interesting. I found it just very ironic that would be where my thoughts first went, but at the same time, it's an interesting conversation to have in any context. Okay. You were back. I see you. You were moving. You were face moving.
Awesome.
Thank you for bearing with me.
So we lost connection for 1 minute, but returning to the actual painting, right? You made note of like the name Bluebeard and how in your mind it was the tradition of Blackbeard, right? Who is, again, the sort of archetypal masculine figure. And so for me, it was a play both on that and this is going to sound really nerdy, but Blue Eyes White Dragon, like the Yu-Gi-Oh card. And so, I mean, once again, this is just a play on words. It doesn't relate to the actual piece. One can make an argument that I've just gotten lazier and lazier, like in terms of naming things as time has progressed. But so that's where the name came from, to touch on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The more I end up doing creative work, the less I feel like the point of origin matters for what your idea has turned into. And I feel like with painting and drawing and those like more tangible creative elements than writing, it's all the more obvious. Like, oh, I saw a really cool reflection in my mirror, and it inspired me to create this whole universe in drawing. Mm-hmm. And great. Does it have to have a deeper meaning? Well, maybe later it will, but in the creative process, no. Mm-hmm. And that's fine.
Right. I think that like what artists are doing, and this is actually something Jordan Peterson has said, is they're taking like meaning and sort of abstract truths that are just kind of floating around in their heads and then assimilating them onto the canvas, even in ways that they aren't consciously aware of, right? And so when you look at a painting, it has these layers of meaning, quite literally, like put onto it. And I think that that's probably correct. So even if you're just like a Jackson Pollock painting, right? Like it's not even attempting to represent anything. It's non-representational, yet it can still be meaningful.
Mm-hmm. There, a teacher back in high school once told us about, we were studying this book called Homo Faber. It's a German book about a man who is basically completely apathetic to everything until he actually started to feel again. And it's only in the change of his written voice that we are able to notice his growth in human emotions. And when the author was interviewed about the meaning behind this mechanical man, in a sense, he was like, why does it have to have a meaning? And then people were like throwing interpretations at him, and he was just like, I just wrote this. Just like, you found deeper meaning in it. I just wrote a story.
See, I hear that and I'm instantly like, no, he was struggling with this animus. Like I go over like Jungian perspective immediately. But like, no, it's totally true. And even well, I won't go down the nerdy path of.
No, go for it. Get nerdy.
Well, no, there's this in a similar way. There's this really popular 90s anime called Neon Genesis Evangelion, which I don't know if you've heard of.
I've never, you know what, anime was the one thing that I never got into. I was into the K-drama, the J-drama, the manga, all of that, just never anime.
But it had like a resurgence recently, right? And it's, these melancholic teenagers who have to like operate these giant robots to save the world. And like, it's very painful for them. And so like, there's all this stress put on them. And it's like, how do these young kids like react to being put in this situation of responsibility? And then it has all these Christian themes of like crosses and obviously Evangelion. And there's like tons of speculation on the fan side about what it ultimately means and all this. And so the creator was interviewed and he's like, and they asked him, well, what were you thinking about? What does this mean? What does that mean? He's like, we chose Christian themes because we thought they looked cool. Like we thought the cross was like a really cool looking symbol, and like there's no meaning to this. You guys are just you're coming from a weird perspective. I didn't mean this to mean anything, right?
That I think that's where some of JBP's criticisms kind of like I'm iffy on them when I read his ideas like around postmodernism. I respect them. I still need to get more informed to agree or disagree with them in an intelligent and informed way. But in a college class again years ago, we were talking about postmodernism and structuralism and post-structuralism and the whole modernist movement in literature, in English literature specifically. And one of the things that we looked at was how art has evolved to have meaning described to it and where that meaning comes from. And a lot of the questions around like modernist, structuralist, postmodernist, post-structuralist movements talk about is like the separation of the art from the author, in a sense. And there's something absolutely fascinating of looking at a piece of work both in the perspective of this artist created it, and at the same time, this is just a piece of art. And the way that you will then understand and interpret it is going to be completely different. And that interpretation, I find it fascinating to see how it'll affect the way that you look at the piece of art, basically. And that contrast is something that's absolutely like amazing to me.
Right. Man, it's unfortunate that we're coming up on like your hard cutoff, because these are the questions that I've been trying to like get at for like the whole of the series. But
do it. My roommate's not here because like I'm basically worried because she needs to drop her dog off with me, and I'm at a coffee shop that has a dog park, hence the barking.
Okay. I mean, I'll just as quickly as possible do my little short thing on this. So I understand and agree that the author is dead, right? And everything is the text. To just use the quick jargon, right? If you're familiar with this conversation, which you appear to be, right?
Somewhat.
You know what I mean when I say that the author is dead, and that everything is the text.
Yeah, I understand the idea behind that.
So I agree with those things, but I don't go like full postmodernist and saying, and all interpretations are equal, right? So like if you have, I'm trying to think of a famous picture. So like Caravaggio's depiction of Mary or something like that, right? You can't tell me that is Ivanka Trump, right? That's not a legitimate interpretation. There's a set of possible things, right? We can curtail this set of like possible interpretations and say some are unreasonable.
So this is going to fall into a debate that everyone, like even very good friends of mine, completely disagree with me about. I believe in moral relativism. So if someone is looking at a piece of art and saying this piece that is representing the Holy Mother Mary reminds me of Ivanka Trump, then hey, you know what? If that's what you think about when you're looking at the piece of art, good on you. I don't see that. I don't agree with that. I don't believe that. But hey, good on you.
Right.
And my take on moral relativism isn't that there is no right and wrong. It is to say that my interpretation of things belongs completely to me, and I feel like there's a sense of rightness and justice in the way that I look at things. And I will typically gravitate towards people who have, at least to some extent, the same kind of morality as I do. And so if you extend it to the world of art, it's going to be, well, they will probably look at art in a very similar light as I do. And that means that our conversations around art and the creative process are going to be extremely interesting, because it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's going to be similar enough that we're going to understand each other and we're going to grow from that discussion. I'm not going to get anything from talking about the rendering of Holy Mother Mary with someone who's saying this is Ivanka Trump.
Right.
Like I'm not going to get anything from that conversation.
Well, but to distance this from like the moral relativist aspect of it, strictly in terms of like interpretation, I do think that one important point is that I don't believe that there is just like, so I certainly don't believe that the only truth is the scientific truth. I believe that truth exists on multiple levels within individuals and in groups. And I'm about to make a video about this that hopefully will be interesting. But basically, I think that your personal interpretation can be totally valid, but only within yourself, right?
Yes.
So yeah, this reminds you of Ivanka Trump. That's fine. But if you go on to make the claim that this picture is about Ivanka Trump, right? Like
well, that would just be naive, because this piece of art was created long before she was alive, right?
Sure, but
and so just like that can't be a point of reference. That can be your point of reference for this piece of art, but historically and factually, that's not possible.
Well, that only makes sense if you believe that that the meaning is embedded by the author, right? So if that would imply that the author's purpose is what's important. But like if we agree that the author is dead, or if you were to assume that the author is dead, still I don't think that you can make the claim that like the meaning of that, your personal meaning can be extrapolated to other kinds of meaning, right?
This might be, so yes, the artist is dead. And so the piece of art exists on its own in this pseudo timeless context. This is me in my perspective. I hear there's a but to add to that sentence. And it is historical context. No matter what, you can't say that the point of inspiration of a piece of art that was created 50 years ago is current to today. You can interpret meaning, and you can say a piece of art that was created 50 years ago is reflecting on a very current issue. But you can't extrapolate that it is inspired by a current issue that hasn't happened yet when the piece of art itself was created.
Right. So I think then we agree that despite the death of the author, everything is the text, right? So like everything being the text means that the author's like personal interpretation is like a valid place to like get meaning. So is contemporary politics and what have you. But ultimately we can limit the set of like possible interpretations. It's not infinite. Like this picture about Mother Mary is most definitely not about unicorns, despite you having like, despite like you saying that it reminds you of unicorns. It's not about that.
Yeah, but this is where like another example is my book club at Fee about Jordan B. Peterson. We are talking about chapters of his book, and we are using that as a basis for a larger conversation that will sometimes come back to ideas that he's presenting, whether in agreement or disagreement or just an observation. But we are actually going much further beyond his own writing to talk about these much larger topics that we are inspired by in the writing. And when you look at art, that is very much what you're looking at. The artist is dead. The piece of art is there, and you are extrapolating meaning, and you are extrapolating larger picture conversations around it that is inspired by the art. And the art itself doesn't reflect that. You are reflecting that meaning from the art.
Well, Rebecca, is there anything else about either this topic or this piece that you would like to say or ask?
No, I like your style.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thanks for coming on, Rebecca, and I'll see you next time.
Bye.